In order for muscles to contract on the cellular level, we rely on an explanation called the sliding filament theory. And the idea here is that actin and myosin fibers slide past each other. But what are the steps to make that happen? It all starts with an action potential, that is a nerve impulse. So your brain sends a message through your nervous system to the muscle. When the nervous signal arrives at the end of that long axon, the end of the long nerve cell, it's going to release a chemical. That chemical is called acetylcholine, ACH. The acetylcholine is going to cross the gap between the nerve and the muscle. That's called the neuromuscular junction. There's a little gap there. That's called the synapse. But ACH will cross that synapse. Acetylcholine crosses that synapse. As soon as that neurotransmitter crosses that synapse, then it's going to trigger a series of reactions in the muscle. So what will happen is the muscle will release calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that instigates a muscle contraction. For muscles to contract, the myosin has to connect to the actin fibers. So the myosin fibers have these little things that look like golf clubs, and they form what's called a cross bridge. They make a connection to the actin fiber, so that cross bridge forms. Then the little end of the golf club kind of ratchets forward. That's called the power stroke. So we have a cross bridge, power stroke. Then there's going to be some energy that's required to detach that cross bridge. So the detaching of the cross bridge recocks the myosin, and then the actin can slide back to where it was. So the process is cross bridge, power stroke, detach, relax. It's the detach that requires the energy, the ATP for muscle contraction. Well, why don't your muscles just contract all the time? What's allowing you to control the contractions? Well, think of it like a safety mechanism is preventing the muscles from just contracting willy-nilly. That safety mechanism are two proteins, troponin and tropomyosin. Troponin and tropomyosin block the binding between the actin and myosin. So the myosin head cannot bind to the actin because the troponin tropomyosin is blocking it. When the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium, it removes that safety, allowing the cross bridge, so that your body can control muscle contraction by regulating the amount of calcium that's released. The calcium removes the safety, the cross bridge can form, power stroke, energy is required to detach, and then relax. So here's what that kind of looks like. The yellow dots there represent calcium. It gets released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That removes the troponin-tropomyosin complex. That allows the cross bridging to occur. The myosin head ratchets forward. It brings the actin in toward the middle of the sarcomere. ATP is required to recock that myosin head to replace it. The actin slides back to where it was, and it looks something like this as the actin and myosin kind of ratchet the sarcomere to get shorter. And then when it detaches and relaxes, the muscle can extend again. Well, muscle contractions are going to continue so long as ATP is present, because that ATP is required to detach those muscles. But do you make ATP if you're dead? And the answer is no. So without the ATP, the cross bridges will remain intact. That means the muscles will stay contracted. That's why when a person dies, their muscles stiffen up. We sometimes refer to that person as a stiff, because their muscles are stiff. Rigor mortis has set in. Well, actin and myosin are just proteins, so they're going to gradually break down and relax after 2 to 3 days. But it takes the first 3 to 5 hours for the body to lose the ATP that it has and the muscles to stiffen up. Forensic scientists can use this information to help them determine the time of death. So if a body is stiff, that means that the person's been dead for at least 3, maybe 5 hours. But if the body is limp, that means that the person has been dead probably for over 2 to 3 days. If the body is cold and limp, then they definitely know it's been dead for a long time. If the body is warm and stiff, the body is maybe only dead for 5 hours. If the body is warm and limp, well then, it hasn't even been 3 hours yet. There hasn't been enough time for the body to stiffen up. Muscle contraction relies heavily on ATP production. Your body produces ATP in one of two ways: aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration requires oxygen, whereas anaerobic respiration does not. This production of ATP happens in your mitochondria. Cellular respiration that requires oxygen is happening in your mitochondria. That's why we call it the powerhouse of the cell. It's the energy producer of the cell. But outside of the mitochondria, we can produce some energy. We can break down a glucose molecule by glycolysis and get a little bit of energy for that. We make the most energy, though, when there's plenty of oxygen present. What we do with that energy is break the sugar molecule down into ATP. Then our body uses that ATP. It uses the chemical bond, the energy in the chemical bond, and that's going to supply most of the energy for the cell. We can recharge or recycle that ATP we lose or break off the third phosphate. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So there's an A, and then there's a P, and a P. So the chemical bond between the second and third P, that's where all the energy is stored. So we break that chemical bond, we release that phosphate. That's how we go from ATP triphosphate to ADP diphosphate. Well, our body has a chemical called creatine phosphate, and that creatine phosphate can help recharge that ATP molecule by adding the phosphate to the ADP. So we can recharge that ATP pretty rapidly with something called the phosphagen system, and that's what we're doing. We're using creatine phosphate in order to recharge that ATP so we can use that energy for things like muscle contraction. Well, whenever a muscle contracts, we call that a twitch. So the muscle contracts completely, relaxes completely. That's a twitch. What if we can contract the muscle, and then before it has a chance to relax completely, we contract it again? In that case, we can add the strength of the contractions together. That's called summation. We're increasing the strength of the muscle contraction, and we're sustaining then the contraction. So a sustained muscle contraction is called tetanus. Can we keep the muscle contracted forever? And the answer is no. At some point we start to run out of ATP. We're no longer able to maintain the muscle contraction. Fatigue sets in, and even though our brain is telling our muscles to contract, we can't do it, and our muscles relax. When our muscles are in a state of contraction and we're breaking down that sugar, without oxygen, we produce a byproduct called lactic acid. Lactic acid causes the burning sensation in your muscles. We say, oh, it burns, it burns. Because that's happening with a system that does not require oxygen, we've entered a position that's referred to as oxygen debt. In other words, we're using up energy, but we don't have enough oxygen to replenish the energy that we're using. At some point, we run out of that ATP, and then our muscles can't contract. We've hit the wall, fatigue. When we're in a fatigue state, we're going to breathe rapidly. Why? We're trying to pay back the oxygen debt. We're going to use that oxygen to switch over to aerobic respiration, engage our mitochondria, produce a lot of ATP, and try to get the energy back that we need for additional muscle contractions. So here's a little graph that's illustrating the idea of oxygen deficit and debt. All right, so our cells need oxygen, and at some point we can't get oxygen to our cells fast enough. Like, even though we're breathing rapidly, we're burning more oxygen than we can deliver. So that difference begins to widen. All right, that's the oxygen debt. Like, we don't have enough. All right, so we're demanding more oxygen and ATP than we can supply. That leads to fatigue. So we go to this place where we have to pay that difference back. So we're breathing rapidly for a while after exercise. to get our body to switch back over to aerobic respiration, to produce a lot more ATP so that we can have energy again.